Now, in part 2 of our discussion of modern African art, I want to look at the development of art schools within the colonial and post-colonial period and how they were used to try and perpetuate a lot of basic mythology about where African art was coming from. To begin with, let's go to the Belgian Congo, which is where the original colonial program began. And one of the ways that the Belgian Congo demonstrated to the outside world that they were doing some important cultural work for the people of the region was that they set up this art school, by Pierre Romain Defoncé. And it was called Lahangar, which basically means the warehouse. And it was in the capital of Lubumbashi, and it was started in 1944. I don't have a lot of information about this, but what I know from the kind of instruction and what we can see from the art was that Pierre Romain Defoncé says that people in Africa are naturally talented, and that his goal was not to teach them art, but to give them the materials and allow them to explore them and discover their own natural artistic ability. So here again, this idea of something African art is a kind of natural consequence of being African. It's not something learned, it's not something studied, it's something that is just sort of innate in Africa. And of course, we know that in traditional African art, these are craftsmen who are trained and learn these skills and the symbols and the secret ingredients and everything that goes into African art traditionally is a very studied and very precise kind of art. And what this was trying to create was this idea that somehow all of that work earlier was somehow natural product of just being African and not something that was deliberate or schooled or studied among them. We just have to look at the art that was produced in the school, and here we can see Mwenzi Kibwanga, who was one of the more successful artists of the Lahangar school. And you can see again, like we saw elsewhere in the early negritude, was this idea of a celebration of native life, simple production of ordinary things. There's no real specific identity. There's no attempt to create anything that is genuinely a representation of anything African. These, of course, are images that were enormously popular with other Europeans. They are making art that's not for sale to Africans. This is really something that people in Africa, tourists, would purchase, and that is what sustained the school for the production of art. And of course, while Pierre Romain would say he didn't instruct anyone per se, it's clear from the continuity from all the artists participating that he clearly praised and encouraged some kinds of production over others. Another school that was created after Africa was gaining independence, and this is in Nigeria, and it was Yuli Bir, who arrived in Ibadan, and he decided he wanted to build a nightclub, and he wanted to have an art school associated with the nightclub. So the nightclub would be drinking and dancing and great music from local performers, and that money would go to establish this Oshogbo school, where he could provide free art supplies and art instruction to local artists. And he just tried to encourage the people who were in there. And the Oshogbo school really had some of those elements where the idea of the natural artist. But Yuli Bir really had a keen sense for something that was intrinsically true to the people here and now and the kinds of things that they were interested in. So I find the work of the Oshogbo group tends to be much more playful It has a willingness to represent the modern world, like you see here in this really fun and fanciful. This is a cement screen that was created in a gas station. And in this, there was a series of sort of figures who are dancing. We can see in the upper left, gas station attendant filling out a car, someone riding a bicycle, other automobiles. It's all done in this really sort of crazy, playful, silly way. And it's done with this organic shapes and forms. And it's sort of riffing on the themes of transportation and civic and community participation. And I think what you find really interesting about this is the way in which it was something that would then also be displayed and seen by the people in the community. Now, this Oshogbo group has become quite famous, and I'm showing you here on the top the way they have rescued these cement reliefs from the gas station and preserved them, and they're now in a museum in Washington, D.C., the Freer Gallery. And if you ever go to the Freer Gallery, I highly recommend it. It's a great collection of traditional and modern African art. Here's another example of the Oshogbo group, a very unique, different kind of material being used here. This is aluminum, and Asiro Olatunde has been sort of pounding. We're using a nail to kind of create a textured and smooth portions of the aluminum to kind of create a sort of relief drawing where he's created this sort of jungle scene with birds and a snake and a lion. And again, this rather unique use of materials, a rather playful, interesting combination of symbols and ideas that are, again, part of the ordinary life of the people around. Now, one of the most famous artists to emerge out of the Oshogbo group and really became a name all to himself was the artist, the name Twins77. And there's a lot of mystery around Twins77, even his name, which he says he gave to himself. He was full of stories and full of a kind of mysterious past. He said he had designed and made his own clothing. He was the lead singer in a band. He shows up at the Mbari Club and he's performing, and they are so thrilled by this young, energetic man that they invite him to join the art class. And he says he's never painted, but then sits down and turns out these extraordinary works. And here's an example on the right of one of Twins77's early paintings. And you can see this kind of ghost world with these spirits. And he just had the most uncanny way of painting. He would really start in one corner and he would just carefully work every part of that surface until he had arrived at the other edge of the picture and it would be done. And he did a lot of pictures of spirits and ghosts based on stories that he says his mother had told him. And this is where his name comes in, because he says he chose this name Twin77 for himself because he says he was the sole surviving seventh twin from his mother. So his mother had 7 sets of twin. All of them had died, and he was the only one that had survived the 7th of the 7th set. And so with that miraculous story, he had quite a remarkable life as an artist. And he became later an international phenomenon and has toured the world and performed and done numerous paintings in different venues all over the place. One theme that he did, a number of pictures, was this idea of devil's dog, the servant, the creature that does the devil's work. And so it has lots of legs because it can get around and cause all kinds of mischief. And it's there sort of to entice us and lead us into our own troubles and lead us away from where we ought to be. So we see a number of these depictions of the devil's dog. Here's another example of the devil's dog up here on the left, and below a slightly later period of work, he began sort of cutting and building up his pictures in three-dimensional textural way. All of his work is very colorful, playful, and visually incredibly exciting to see. Part of Nigeria and its growth as an English colony, one-time English colony, gained independence, English has a very interesting and important cultural legacy. And for people who wanted to raise their status, English is a very important way to do this. And so there's this whole class of books that have been written that are in English, but in a kind of, it's called Mad English. It is not completely written in standard British English. And some of the images are very poetic and beautiful. One author who came out of this period, who would eventually team up with Twin 77, was Amos Tutuola, and he wrote a series of novels, most famously one called My Life in the Bush of Ghosts from 1954. And in this novel, he talks about ghosts and spirits, again, stories that his mother had told him. And of course, this became a perfect fit for Amos Tutuola and Twin 77. And Twin 77 did a number of book jacket covers for the work of Amos Tutuola. Another one of his books that I would highly recommend is called The Palm Wine Drinkard. Another very important school in East Africa, in Zimbabwe, was a number of sculptors that emerged out of there. And the story of the emergence of this is quite fascinating. What happened was there was a work team that was building a road through the country. And one of the ways that the manager, the man who's sort of operating this work team, was to get his men to stop running off and spending all their money in the bars, is he would get them to carve stones. And then the people driving along the side of the road, the tourists, would stop and they would sell their sculptures to the tourists. And this became enormously popular. And some of them went on to become full-fledged sculptors from this rather humble beginnings. And Jora Mariga was one of the early sculptors who went on and using the Zimbabwean stone, sort of green serpentine, a lot of soapstone in this area. If you remember from the beginning of our previous lecture when we were talking about the Great Zimbabwe, that statue of the eagle, that's that sort of green soapstone serpentine that's very common in the area. And so this became a new sculptural movement that began in Zimbabwe. The artist who really spearheaded a lot of this was this Scottish artist named Frank McEwen, who had been hanging around in Paris with all the cubists and surrealists. And he's sort of disgusted by modern Paris. He gets a job at the National Gallery of Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe. And here he also decides to sort of set up a school to train the people in the city and get them to make art that will be sold. And he's very instrumental in creating a kind of sculpture school at the school. One of the artists who emerges out of this school attached to the National Gallery of Rhodesia is Henry Munyaradzi. And I've seen his work a number of places. Just recently, when I was in St. Louis, you go into the Botanical Garden and you can see one of his statues inside the Botanical Garden of St. Louis. And so you can see a lot of these stones that these men are working with. The original shape of the stone is still sort of present. There's an organic overall rock-like form that they see the rock and then they sort of cut into it and shape it and form it just enough to sort of reveal the idea that they see within the stone. So these stone sculptures still retain their stone-like demeanor. You see here in this his depiction of family. Here is another one where you could again create emotional presence. This is a little more finished, but again, the sort of the overall shape of the stone is still present within the statue. Another artist who emerges very early on in modern African art is the man Valente Malangatana. He has a Christian upbringing, and he's one of the early artists who starts in the 1960s to really try to push for moving away from the cliches of negritude and the simple depictions of village life, and start to represent some of the more fraught, emotional, conflicted ideas of modernity and modern Europe and modern African life. And you can see in this sort of tense encounter between a kind of Christian religious man and this woman who is sort of enveloped in flowers and other organic forms. And I would say that while the painting is not necessarily successful in its overall completion, it is at least honestly trying to wrestle with what is truly happening in Africa. And that so much of this work, this early modern work, is either hopelessly mired in the patterns of what they think Cubism is about or Surrealism is about, and to really try and bring in a more tense friction with the culture of modern Africa. Here is another work by Valente Malangatana in Guinea, and you can see here a more polished, more intense, painterly quality that has come out in his mature work. Still, this way, which is sort of blending of people. You don't see the sort of happy villagers and sense of a symbiotic relationship with nature. Instead, you see this fractured world, a world that seems more emerging and is held together in a very fragile way.